The wind never really stopped on the plains of Pannonia Inferior. It just changed its mood, sometimes a low, restless whisper sliding through the grass, sometimes a sharp, biting force that cut across the land like a blade. And on the day Lucius Domitius Aurelianus was born, sometime around 214 AD, it carried with it the chill of an unforgiving autumn, the kind that settled deep into the bones and reminded everyone living along the frontier that this was not Rome, not the marble city of emperors and senators, but the edge of the world where survival itself was an achievement. Near what is now Sremska Mitrovica, then known as Sirmium, small settlements clung to life along the muddy banks of the Sava River. Their wooden homes crouched low against the wind, their thatched roofs patched and repatched by hands that knew no rest. And in one of these modest dwellings, built from timber cut from nearby forests and packed with earth against the cold, a child entered a world that offered nothing easily. His father, a man whose name history barely remembers, was likely a colonist, a tenant farmer tied, not by chains, but by obligation to land he did not own, working soil that yielded only through relentless effort, bound to produce grain, livestock, or coin for a distant landlord who would never see the frostbitten mornings or the cracked hands that paid his wealth. This was not slavery, not quite, but it was a life that offered little chance of escape, a cycle of labor that passed from one generation to the next like an inheritance no one wanted but no one could refuse. The land itself was both enemy and provider. In winter the rivers froze solid, sometimes thick enough for men and horses to cross, though always with the silent risk that the ice might betray them. While in summer the same waters could swell and flood entire fields, washing away months of work in a single violent surge. Forests pressed in from all sides, dense and dark, filled with the sounds of animals and the unknown, and every acre of cleared land represented countless hours of cutting, burning, digging, and hauling, work that began before sunrise and ended only when the light disappeared completely. Education, in the formal sense, was a luxury far beyond reach. There were no tutors, no scrolls, no time for philosophy or rhetoric, but Aurelian was not uneducated, not in the ways that mattered where he lived. He learned to read the land, to understand weather patterns, to judge the strength of a river current, to track movement in the forest, to recognize danger before it fully revealed itself. He learned the value of silence, of patience, of watching more than speaking, skills that would one day matter far more than any formal schooling. As he grew older, the presence of Rome became both more visible and more distant at the same time. Roads cut through the landscape, built by soldiers long gone, still used by traders, messengers, and military patrols. Forts stood along the frontier, part of the vast defensive network known as the Limes, their stone walls a stark contrast to the wooden homes of local settlements, symbols of imperial power that promised protection but could not always deliver it. Roman soldiers passed through from time to time, disciplined. The Roman soldiers who passed through the settlements along the Sava River were never just travelers. They were something else entirely, something that drew the attention of every young man who watched them, because they carried with them a different kind of life, one that seemed, at least from a distance, to offer structure where there had been chaos, purpose where there had been only survival, and perhaps most importantly, a way out. They marched in formation even when the road was empty, their boots striking the ground in a rhythm that felt unnatural compared to the scattered movement of farmers and traders, their armor worn but maintained, their weapons not decorative but clearly used, and there was something about the way they carried themselves, a quiet confidence that came not from comfort, but from experience. These were men who had faced the same dangers that haunted the frontier, but instead of merely enduring them, they had been trained to confront them. Aurelian would have watched them more closely than most, not out of idle curiosity, but with a kind of focused attention that came naturally to him, studying how they moved, how they spoke, how they interacted with each other. He would have noticed the hierarchy, the way orders were given and followed without hesitation, the way even the smallest unit functioned as a single entity rather than a collection of individuals. It was a stark contrast to the loose, improvised cooperation of village life, where decisions were often made collectively and authority was tied to age or experience rather than rank. By the time he reached full adulthood, the pressures that had defined his childhood had only intensified. The 230s and 240s were not kind years for the empire, and certainly not for its frontier provinces. Raids became more frequent, more organized, more dangerous. What had once been opportunistic strikes began to resemble coordinated campaigns, with larger groups crossing the Danube River at multiple points, overwhelming local defenses and pushing deeper into Roman territory than ever before. At the same time, the empire itself seemed to be unraveling. Emperors rose and fell with alarming speed, often through violence rather than succession, and each new ruler demanded loyalty, taxes, and soldiers, all while struggling to maintain control over territories that were increasingly difficult to govern. The assassination of Severus Alexander in 235 AD marked the beginning of what historians would later call the crisis of the 3rd century. Though for those living through it, it did not feel like a defined period. It felt like a world slowly losing its structure. For men like Aurelian, this chaos created both danger and opportunity. The traditional paths to advancement, tied to birth and social status, had begun to break down under the weight of constant warfare and administrative collapse. The army, more than ever, became the primary path for anyone seeking to rise beyond the circumstances of their birth. It offered pay, however inconsistent, food, however basic, and the possibility of reward, however uncertain. But more than that, it offered identity. And so, at an age when many men would already have been settled into the same life as their fathers, Aurelian made a decision that would change everything. Sometime between 253 and 260 AD, during the turbulent reign of Gallienus, he presented himself for recruitment into the Roman army. He was older than most new recruits, likely in his late 30s or even early 40s, an age that in earlier generations would have been considered far beyond the ideal for beginning military service. But these were not earlier generations. The empire was desperate. Years of continuous warfare had drained its manpower, and commanders along the frontiers could no longer afford to be selective in the same way. They needed men who could fight, who could endure, who could think under pressure, and in many ways, Aurelian was better suited than the younger men who stood beside him. The recruitment process itself reflected the urgency of the time. Gone were the elaborate ceremonies and lengthy evaluations that had once characterized entry into the legions. Instead, local commanders, often operating with considerable independence, assessed potential soldiers quickly and practically. Physical strength, stamina, basic familiarity with weapons, and, perhaps most importantly, evidence of resilience. These were the qualities that mattered. Aurelian would have stood among other men from similar backgrounds, farmers, laborers, survivors of the same harsh conditions, each hoping, or perhaps simply accepting, that this was the next step. There was no guarantee of success, no promise of glory, but there was a clear understanding that staying where they were offered little more than continued struggle. When he was accepted, it marked a turning point not just in his life, but in his identity. He was no longer simply a man of the frontier. He was now part of something larger, something that stretched across continents, a machine that had been built over centuries and refined through countless wars. The transition was not easy, and it was not meant to be. Training began almost immediately, and it was relentless. New recruits were subjected to intense physical conditioning designed to push them beyond their limits, and then push them further still. Long marches were a daily reality, often covering distances of 20 miles or more while carrying full equipment, armor, weapons, supplies, everything a soldier would need in the field. These marches were not just about endurance. They were about discipline, about learning to move as a unit, to maintain formation even when exhausted, to respond to commands without hesitation. And so, training adapted. What began to emerge was not just a soldier, but a thinker, someone who did not simply follow instructions, but understood the reasoning behind them, who observed patterns, who adapted, who questioned when something did not work, and looked for ways to improve it. The army noticed. Promotion during this period was no longer tied strictly to time served or connections. The ongoing crisis had forced a shift toward merit, toward immediate effectiveness. Men who demonstrated ability, who could lead, who could think, were advanced quickly, sometimes astonishingly so compared to earlier standards. Aurelian began to rise. At first, it was small responsibilities, leading a group of men during training exercises, being trusted with minor tasks that required coordination and reliability. But each success built on the last, and soon he was entrusted with more significant roles, positions that required not just personal skill, but the ability to command others, to make decisions under pressure, to take responsibility for outcomes that affected more than just himself. His experience on the frontier became one of his greatest strengths. While others relied solely on what they had been taught, Aurelian combined that knowledge with practical understanding, recognizing terrain advantages, anticipating enemy movements, adjusting tactics based on real conditions rather than rigid doctrine. This was particularly valuable along the Danube River, where much of his early service took place. The river was both a barrier and a vulnerability, a line that separated Rome from its enemies, but could be crossed under the right conditions, especially during winter when ice created temporary bridges, or during coordinated assaults that overwhelmed local defenses. Here, Aurelian saw firsthand the limitations of traditional approaches. Static defenses, fixed positions, predictable patrols, these could be studied, anticipated, and exploited by determined opponents. The enemy was learning, adapting, evolving, and Rome had to do the same or risk being outmaneuvered again and again. It was in these conditions that Aurelian began to develop the ideas that would later define his command style. He understood that mobility was not just an advantage, it was essential. That information, knowing where the enemy was, where they were going, what they intended, could determine the outcome of a conflict before it even began. That coordination between different types of forces, infantry, cavalry, missile troops, had to be fluid, responsive, capable of shifting as the situation changed. These were not abstract concepts to him. They were lessons learned through experience, through observation, through moments where failure could mean death. And as the years passed, as the empire continued to struggle, as new threats emerged and old ones grew stronger, Aurelian was no longer just a man who had escaped the life he was born into. He was becoming something far more dangerous. A soldier shaped by hardship, refined by discipline, and sharpened by a world that offered no forgiveness for weakness. And soon, that world would test him on a scale far greater than anything he had faced so far. War on the frontier did not announce itself with grand speeches or banners raised against the sky. It came in fragments, in rumors carried by traitors, in burned farms discovered days too late, in the sudden absence of entire villages that had existed only weeks before, and by the time Aurelian began serving along the Danube River. He realized quickly that this kind of war had very little to do with glory and everything to do with endurance. The Danube stretched across the land like a living boundary, wide and deceptively calm in places, violent and unpredictable in others. And for Rome, it was both shield and weakness at the same time. Fortresses dotted its southern banks, stone walls reinforced over generations, towers rising above the landscape, where watchmen scanned the horizon day and night, always searching for movement, for smoke, for anything that might signal another incursion. Between these strong points lay smaller outposts, wooden watchtowers, patrol routes worn into the earth by years of marching boots, and beyond them, open land that belonged to no one and everyone at once. Aurelian's first real encounters with the enemy did not come in massive battles, but in these uncertain spaces, where visibility was limited, communication unreliable, and every decision carried weight. Patrols moved cautiously, never straying too far from support, but often forced to operate independently, reacting to situations that changed faster than orders could arrive. It was here that he learned one of the most important truths of frontier warfare, that survival depended on awareness long before it depended on strength. The enemy rarely appeared as a unified force. Instead, they came in small, fast-moving groups, Sarmatian riders sweeping across the plains with terrifying speed, their horses bred for endurance and accustomed to harsh climates. Their long lances capable of striking from a distance before a Roman soldier could close the gap. Germanic war bands moved differently, less focused on mobility and more on sudden, overwhelming aggression, appearing from forests or hills with loud, coordinated charges designed to break formations before they could fully form. Against such enemies, traditional Roman methods were often too slow, too rigid. Aurelian saw units struggle to adapt, officers relying on drills that assumed a different kind of opponent, soldiers trained for formation, finding themselves isolated, reacting instead of controlling the situation. These moments left an impression on him, not as criticism, but as observation of a growing understanding that the battlefield was changing and that those who failed to change with it would not survive. His own role began modestly, part of cavalry detachments assigned to reconnaissance, screening larger forces and responding quickly to threats that infantry could not reach in time. At first, these missions were straightforward: observe, report, avoid unnecessary engagement, but the reality rarely followed instructions so neatly. Encounters happened, often unexpectedly, and in those moments hesitation could be fatal. Aurelian adapted quickly. Where others might have hesitated, unsure whether to engage or withdraw, he learned to read the situation in an instant, to judge not just the number of enemies, but their intent, their formation, their confidence. He began to understand that not every fight needed to be fought, but also that some needed to be ended quickly, decisively, before they could escalate into something larger. One early engagement, small by the standards of history, but significant for those involved, took place during a late autumn patrol when his unit encountered a group of Sarmatian riders attempting to drive stolen livestock back across the river. The Roman patrol was outnumbered, the terrain uneven, visibility limited by low hills and scattered trees. The expected response would have been to shadow the group, report their position, and wait for reinforcements. Aurelian chose differently. He recognized that the Sarmatians were stretched out, focused on controlling the herd rather than preparing for combat. Their formation loose, their attention divided. Instead of withdrawing, he pushed forward, directing his men to strike quickly at the flanks, targeting the riders, controlling the animals rather than those positioned for defense. The attack was sudden, aggressive, and focused, disrupting the cohesion of the group before they could reorganize. It was not a clean victory. There were losses, moments of chaos, and the ever-present risk that the enemy might regroup and counterattack. But the result was decisive enough. The herd was recovered, the remaining raiders driven off, and more importantly, Aurelian's actions demonstrated something that his superiors could not ignore: an ability to assess, to act, and to succeed under conditions where hesitation might have led to failure. Incidents like this began to define his reputation. He was not reckless, though some might have described him that way at first. He was calculated, willing to take risks, but only when he believed the conditions justified them. He observed constantly, learning not just from his own actions, but from those around him, from successes and failures alike, building a mental map of how different enemies behaved, how terrain influenced outcomes, how timing could turn a disadvantage into an opportunity. As months turned into years, his responsibilities grew. He was given command of larger units, first small groups of cavalry, then more significant detachments tasked with independent operations. These assignments required more than personal skill. They required leadership, the ability to coordinate multiple elements, to maintain discipline over extended periods, to ensure that men remained effective even when exhausted, hungry, or uncertain. The Danube frontier provided endless opportunities to test these abilities. Raids became more frequent during certain seasons, particularly when the river conditions favored crossing. Winter was especially dangerous. When the waters froze, what had been a barrier became a pathway, and entire groups could cross at points where no permanent defenses existed. Roman commanders were forced to spread their forces thin, try to anticipate where the next incursion might occur, often reacting after the fact rather than preventing it entirely. Aurelian began to see patterns in these movements. He noticed how certain groups favored specific crossing points, how they timed their raids based on weather and visibility, how they coordinated distractions in one area while striking in another. These observations allowed him to position his forces more effectively, not simply responding to attacks, but anticipating them, intercepting raiders before they could reach their targets, or cutting off their retreat paths before they could escape. His use of cavalry became increasingly refined, where traditional doctrine emphasized support roles. Pursuit after infantry engagement, Aurelian began to treat cavalry as the primary force in certain situations. He organized his units to move quickly, to operate independently when necessary, to strike with precision rather than brute force. He integrated missile troops where possible, using them to disrupt enemy formations before committing to close combat, and he trained his men to maintain cohesion even while moving at speed, a difficult skill that required constant practice. This approach did not always align with established methods, and not all commanders approved. Some viewed his tactics as unconventional, even risky, a departure from the discipline that had defined Roman success for centuries. But results were difficult to argue with. Engagements that might have dragged on or ended inconclusively were resolved more quickly. Losses, while never eliminated, were often reduced compared to less adaptive approaches. Word spread. Among soldiers, reputation traveled faster than official reports. Stories of successful engagements, of bold maneuvers, of a commander who seemed to understand the enemy in ways others did not, these circulated through camps, through conversations around fires, through the informal networks that connected units across the frontier. Aurelian became known not just as a capable officer, but as someone worth following, someone whose decisions, even when aggressive, were grounded in understanding rather than impulse. This growing reputation brought new opportunities and new challenges. He was increasingly called upon to participate in larger operations, coordinated efforts involving multiple units, sometimes entire legions, responding to significant threats along the frontier. These operations revealed another layer of complexity. Coordination between units was not always smooth. Communication delays, differences in command style, varying levels of experience, all of these could complicate even well-planned actions. Aurelian adapted here as well. He learned to work within these larger structures while still applying the principles that had proven effective in smaller engagements. He emphasized clear communication within his own units, ensured that his officers understood not just orders but intent, and maintained flexibility, allowing for adjustments as situations evolved rather than rigidly adhering to initial plans. At the same time, the scale of conflict continued to grow. The enemies Rome faced were no longer isolated groups acting independently. Larger confederations were forming, alliances between tribes that allowed for more coordinated and sustained campaigns. These groups brought greater numbers, more resources, and increasingly sophisticated strategies. They learned from their encounters with Roman forces, adapting their own tactics in response. Aurelian understood that this was not a temporary escalation. It was a shift. The frontier was no longer a line that could be held through static defense alone. It required mobility, intelligence, and the ability to project force quickly across wide areas. It required commanders who could think beyond traditional frameworks, who could adapt as quickly as their opponents. And in this environment, Aurelian did more than survive. He evolved. Each campaign, each engagement, each decision added to his understanding, refining his approach, strengthening his instincts. He became more confident, but not careless, more aggressive, but not reckless. He learned when to push forward and when to hold back, when to engage and when to wait, always balancing risk and reward with a clarity that set him apart. By the time he had established himself as a senior cavalry commander, the man who had once worked the fields of Pannonia was almost unrecognizable. Not because he had forgotten where he came from, but because he had transformed that experience into something far greater. He was no longer shaped by the frontier alone. He was beginning to shape it in return, and far beyond the Danube. Events were unfolding that would soon pull him into a conflict unlike anything he had faced before, a campaign that would test not just his skill, but his ability to survive a disaster that would shake the entire Roman world. Legions were drawn from across the empire, hardened units from the Rhine and Danube, Eastern forces familiar with desert conditions, auxiliary troops from distant provinces, cavalry, infantry, engineers, all brought together into a massive army that may have numbered tens of thousands. It was a display of strength meant to send a message, not just to Persia, but to Rome itself, that the empire was still capable of decisive action. Aurelian, now a respected cavalry commander, found himself part of this force, his experience along the frontier earning him a role that placed him not at the center of political attention, but the edge of danger, where information mattered most. His responsibilities included screening movements, scouting terrain, and protecting the army's flanks, tasks that were critical but often overlooked until they failed. At first, the campaign seemed to unfold as expected. Roman forces advanced, retaking positions along the Euphrates, re-establishing supply lines, pushing into contested territory with the steady confidence of an army accustomed to eventual victory. Fortifications were secured, outposts established, and there was a sense, at least among many officers, that the Persians would soon be forced into a decisive confrontation that Rome, with its numbers and discipline, would win. But Aurelian began to notice something different. The enemy was there, always there, but never in the way the Romans expected. Small groups appeared and disappeared. Skirmishes erupted and ended before they could escalate. Supply lines were harassed, messengers intercepted, isolated units attacked and destroyed. It was not a direct confrontation. It was something more deliberate. Shapur, I was shaping the battlefield without committing to it. Days turned into weeks, and the strain began to show. Supplies became less reliable. The heat, the distance from established bases, the constant movement, all of it wore down the army. Then came disease. It started quietly, as it often did. A few soldiers falling ill, symptoms dismissed as exhaustion or poor food, but spread quickly, moving through the tightly packed camps, weakening men who had already been pushed to their limits. Fever, fatigue, the inability to fight or even stand, and as the numbers grew, so did the unease. An army could endure hunger. It could endure hardship, but disease was something else entirely. It did not fight openly. It did not follow rules. And still, the campaign continued. Valerian pressed forward, perhaps believing that a decisive victory would resolve everything, that momentum, once regained, would erase the setbacks. But the deeper the army moved, the more vulnerable it became, stretched across unfamiliar territory, reliant on supply lines that were increasingly under threat. Aurelian's cavalry units operated constantly during this phase, scouting ahead, attempting to locate Persian forces, to understand their movements, to provide the information that might allow Roman commanders to regain control of the situation. What he found was troubling. The Persians were not retreating in disarray. They were withdrawing in a controlled, deliberate manner, drawing the Roman army further in, shaping its movements, guiding it toward a position of their choosing. The realization came too late. Near the city of Edessa, the Roman army found itself in a position that should never have been allowed, extended, exhausted, and increasingly isolated. Negotiations were suggested, a pause, an opportunity to stabilize the situation, and Valerian, perhaps recognizing the strain on his forces, agreed to meet with Shapur. It was a fatal decision. What followed became one of the most shocking events in Roman history. The meeting was a trap, whether from the beginning or turned into one by circumstance. And instead of negotiation, the emperor was captured. The army, already weakened, already stretched thin, suddenly found itself without its leader, without clear direction, facing an enemy that had anticipated every move. The Battle of Edessa was not a single moment, but a collapse. Persian forces struck with coordination and precision. Heavy cavalry charged where Roman lines were weakest. Horse archers rained arrows from a distance. Infantry moved to isolate and overwhelm units that could no longer support each other. The terrain, the exhaustion, the confusion, all worked against the Romans. Orders broke down. Communication failed. Units fought where they stood, some holding formation, others breaking, trying to regroup, to survive, to escape. It was chaos, but not the kind born of randomness. It was the result of careful planning executed at exactly the right moment. For Aurelian, this was the ultimate test. His command, primarily cavalry, was among the few elements of the army capable of movement under such conditions. While many units were trapped, encircled, or destroyed, he recognized that remaining static meant annihilation. The only chance was to move, to create space, to extract what forces he could before the entire army was consumed. This was not a retreat in the traditional sense. There was no clear path, no secure route, no guarantee that any direction would lead to safety. Persian forces were everywhere, pressing the advantage, targeting fleeing units, turning withdrawal into slaughter. Aurelian acted quickly. He gathered his officers, issued clear, direct orders, and reorganized his units not for battle, but for survival. Cohesion became the priority. Speed mattered, but not at the cost of losing formation. He directed his cavalry to strike not at the main Persian forces, but at the points where pressure was greatest, creating temporary openings, disrupting pursuit long enough to move. Again and again, they fought short, violent engagements, breaking contact as soon as possible, moving before the enemy could fully respond. It required discipline, trust, and an understanding of timing that few possessed. Too slow, and they would be surrounded. Too fast, and they would fragment. Some units joined them as they moved, remnants of infantry formations, scattered groups seeking direction. Others were lost, cut off, overwhelmed before they could reach safety. The retreat was not clean. It was not orderly in the way Roman doctrine would have preferred, but it worked. Aurelian managed to bring a significant portion of his command out of the disaster, leading them back toward Roman-controlled territory, preserving not just lives but experience, soldiers who could still fight, who could still contribute to whatever came next. Behind them, the scale of the catastrophe became clear. An emperor captured, something unprecedented. Thousands dead or taken. An army shattered. The psychological impact alone was immense. Rome, which had long projected an image of invincibility, now faced a reality that could not be ignored. For Aurelian, the lessons were immediate and lasting. He had seen what happened when an army relied too heavily on traditional expectations, when it failed to adapt to an opponent who understood its weaknesses. He had seen the consequences of poor intelligence, of overextension, of underestimating an enemy who refused to fight on predictable terms. But he had also proven something, that even in disaster, leadership mattered, that discipline, flexibility, and the ability to make decisions under extreme pressure could mean the difference between destruction and survival. News of his actions spread quickly. In a time when Rome desperately needed capable commanders, men who could not only fight but think, who could not only follow orders but adapt when those orders no longer applied, Aurelian stood out. He was not the only survivor of Edessa, but he was among those who had turned survival into something more, into proof of capability. And as the empire struggled to recover from the shock, as power began to fragment, as new leaders emerged and old structures weakened, Aurelian found himself in a position he had never sought but was increasingly prepared for. He was no longer just a commander on the frontier. He was becoming one of the men who would decide the future of Rome itself, and the chaos that followed the defeat would give him the opportunity to rise even further. The aftermath of the Battle of Edessa did not unfold like a single shock that passed through the empire and faded. It lingered, it spread, it fractured everything that had already been weakening for decades. And for the soldiers who survived, like Aurelian, the world they returned to was no longer the same world they had left behind. The capture of Valerian was not just a military disaster. It was a psychological break. Rome had lost emperors before, many of them, but never like this, never captured alive by a foreign enemy, never turned into a symbol of humiliation. Stories spread quickly, some exaggerated, some perhaps true, of his treatment by Shepherd I, of a Roman emperor reduced to a tool, a warning, a message to anyone who still believed in Rome's invincibility. And while the East struggled to recover, the rest of the empire did not wait. Across the frontiers, enemies tested the limits. Along the Rhine, Germanic confederations pushed harder, sensing weakness. In the Balkans and along the Danube River, raids intensified, more organized, more daring. Provinces that had once relied on distant authority began to look inward, to their own commanders, their own defenses. Power was shifting. The idea of a single, stable center controlling everything from Rome had already been fading, but now it began to break apart openly. Regional leaders, governors, generals, men with armies at their backs, started to act with increasing independence. Some claimed loyalty to the empire while effectively ruling their territories as their own domains. Others made more direct moves, declaring themselves emperors, creating rival courts, rival administrations. For soldiers, this created a new kind of uncertainty. Loyalty was no longer simple. It was no longer just about Rome, or the emperor, or the idea of the empire itself. It became tied to commanders, to men they had served under, fought beside, trusted in battle. The bonds formed in war began to outweigh the abstract authority of distant rulers. Aurelian understood this shift, not as a theory, but as a reality he had to navigate. Returning from the east, his reputation already enhanced by his actions during the retreat, he found himself once again among the forces of the Danubian region, where a distinct military culture had been forming for years. These were not the polished legions of earlier centuries, tied closely to senatorial command and traditional structures. These were frontier armies hardened by constant conflict, practical, direct, and increasingly influential. Within this environment, a network of officers began to stand out. Men who had risen through merit, through experience, through the ability to survive and succeed where others failed. Among them was Claudius II Gothicus, a commander whose name was becoming known across the empire, not because of political maneuvering, but because of his effectiveness against one of Rome's most persistent threats. Claudius had spent years fighting along the Danube, dealing with the same challenges Aurelian knew well: the mobility of enemy forces, the unpredictability of raids, the difficulty of maintaining stable defenses across such a vast and exposed frontier. His approach, like Aurelian's, emphasized adaptability, coordination, and a willingness to move beyond rigid doctrine when necessary. Their paths crossed not in a single dramatic meeting, but through shared operations, overlapping commands, and the gradual recognition of mutual capability. There was no need for formal introductions or elaborate alliances. In this environment, respect was earned through action. A successful engagement, a well-executed maneuver, a decision that saved lives or secured victory. These spoke louder than titles or background. Aurelian proved himself again and again. During campaigns against Gothic forces, he demonstrated the same qualities that had defined his earlier service, but now on a larger scale. The Goths were not a single tribe, but a confederation, capable of assembling large forces, coordinating movements across vast distances, and even conducting naval operations that allowed them to strike deep into Roman territory. Their raids were devastating. Cities along the coast of the Black Sea and beyond were attacked, their defenses overwhelmed, populations captured or killed, wealth carried off. Inland, their armies moved through terrain that favored their methods, avoiding direct confrontation when it did not suit them, choosing when and where to fight. For Roman commanders, this presented a constant challenge. Traditional responses often fell short. Static defenses could be bypassed. Slow-moving forces could not catch raiders who chose to withdraw. Victory required more than strength. It required understanding. Aurelian's role in these campaigns grew steadily. He was no longer simply executing orders. He was contributing to strategy, shaping how forces were deployed, how engagements were approached. His experience with mobile warfare made him particularly valuable, and his willingness to adapt to incorporate elements of enemy tactics into Roman methods, set him apart. He began to refine his use of cavalry even further. Instead of treating it as support, he used it as the core of operations in certain situations, striking quickly, disrupting enemy movements, forcing engagements under conditions that favored Roman discipline. He coordinated closely with infantry and missile troops, creating flexible formations that could respond to changing circumstances without losing cohesion. These methods were not always easy to implement. They required training, trust, and a level of coordination that took time to develop. But when they worked, the results were clear. Gothic forces that might have escaped were intercepted. Raids that might have continued for weeks were cut short. Engagements that might have been inconclusive became decisive. And with each success, Aurelian's reputation grew. He became known among the troops, not just as a commander, but as one who understood how to fight the enemies they faced, who did not cling to outdated methods, who valued effectiveness over tradition. This mattered in a time when survival often depended on the quality of leadership more than anything else. At the same time, his relationships within the military deepened. Figures like Quintilis, though less prominent than his brother, played important roles within the command structure, managing logistics, administration, and the complex systems that allowed armies to function. Through these connections, Aurelian gained insight not just into combat, but into the broader workings of military power, how decisions were made, how resources were allocated, how influence was exercised. He was learning constantly, not in classrooms, not through formal instruction, but through experience, observation, and participation. He saw how alliances formed, how they were maintained, how they could break. He saw the importance of reputation, not just as a fighter, but as a reliable figure, someone others could trust in uncertain times. Because uncertainty defined everything. The empire was no longer a stable structure. It was a shifting landscape of power, with multiple centers, competing claims, and constant threats from both within and without. In the West, breakaway regions began to form their own identities, their own leadership. In the East, the influence of powerful figures challenged central authority. For many, this was a time of fragmentation. For Aurelian, it was a time of preparation. He did not rush toward power. He did not openly challenge existing authority. Instead, he built something more durable, a foundation of respect, of proven ability, of connections that extended across units and commands. He positioned himself not as a rival, but as a solution, someone who could be relied upon when others failed. This approach required patience. Opportunities came and went, crises emerged and were resolved, emperors rose and fell, but Aurelian remained focused, continuing to serve, to lead, to refine his methods. He understood that power taken too early, without sufficient support, could be lost just as quickly. By the end of the 260s, Aurelian was no longer just one among many capable commanders. He was part of a core group, a network of men whose decisions would shape the direction of the empire, whether they intended it or not. And as one emperor's health began to fail, as another succession crisis quietly approached, the conditions that would bring Aurelian to the very center of power were already forming. He had survived the frontier. He had survived disaster. Now, he was standing at the edge of something far greater. And the next step would not be taken on a battlefield alone, but in the dangerous, uncertain space where military power and political ambition collided. By the autumn of 270 AD, the victories that had once brought a sense of stability to the Balkans were already beginning to feel fragile, like something held together by momentum rather than certainty. And at the center of that fragile balance stood Claudius II Gothicus, the man whose campaigns against the Goths had earned him both loyalty and time, though not as much time as the empire truly needed. The camps spread across the region carried a different atmosphere now, not the restless anticipation of battle, but something heavier, quieter, an awareness that something was wrong even before it was openly acknowledged. Soldiers noticed the changes first, as they often did. The increased movement of officers near the imperial pavilion, the guarded expressions, the subtle shifts in routine, all of it pointed toward a reality that no one yet spoke aloud. Illness had entered the camp. What began as whispers soon became undeniable. Men were falling sick, not from wounds or exhaustion, but from something that spread invisibly, moving through the close quarters of military life with terrifying speed. The same conditions that made Roman armies efficient, shared spaces, constant proximity, structured routines, now became weaknesses. And at the center of it, the emperor himself was not immune. Claudius II Gothicus, the man who had led armies to victory, who had stood as a symbol of resistance against external threats, was now confined, his strength fading, his condition worsening with each passing day. Those closest to him understood what it meant. The signs were familiar by now. The empire had seen this before. Plague did not negotiate. Within the imperial pavilion near Sirmium, attempts were made to manage the illness, to treat it, to delay what seemed inevitable. Physicians applied the knowledge they had, methods passed down through generations, balancing humors, administering herbal remedies, controlling diet, but these efforts, however carefully executed, rarely changed the outcome once the disease had taken hold. Outside, the army waited. For Aurelian, this moment was not one of surprise, but of recognition. He had seen enough, lived through enough, to understand how quickly stability could dissolve. The death of an emperor was never just a personal loss. It was a catalyst. It triggered movement, ambition, fear, decisions that could reshape entire regions in a matter of days. And within the military, those decisions would not be made in Rome. They would be made here among the legions. Among the officers, discussions began quietly, carefully at first, then with increasing urgency. There was no official council, no formal process that everyone trusted. The structures that once guided succession had weakened over years of crisis. What remained was influence, reputation, and the support of soldiers. Quintillus, the emperor's brother, had a clear claim. Blood mattered, especially to those who still believed in continuity, in the idea that stability could be preserved through family succession. He held command in Italy, managed key logistical systems, maintained connections with administrative centers. On the surface, he represented order, but the army did not operate on surface impressions. Among the Danubian forces, among the men who had fought in the harshest conditions, who had faced Gothic invasions, who had endured years of constant pressure, the question was different. It was not who had a rightful claim, but who could lead. Aurelian did not step forward immediately. This was not hesitation born of uncertainty, but calculation. He understood the risks. Moving too soon could divide support. Moving too late could allow another to consolidate power. Timing mattered as much as strength. He continued his duties, maintained discipline within his command, observed, listened. And what he heard confirmed what he likely already knew. There was doubt, not loud, not openly expressed in defiance, but present in conversations between officers, in the tone of experienced centurions, in the way soldiers reacted to news of Quintillus assuming authority. Respect, perhaps, but not confidence. The difference between the two was everything. When Claudius II Gothicus finally died, in the cold hours before dawn, the transition began immediately. The imperial system, even in its weakened state, could not tolerate a vacuum. Messages were sent, declarations prepared, authority claimed. Quintillus moved quickly, presenting himself as the successor, addressing troops, emphasizing continuity, stability, the need to maintain what had been built. His words were structured, measured, appropriate. But something was missing. For the soldiers gathered before him, many of whom had fought under Claudius, who had followed commanders into brutal engagements where survival depended on trust, the question remained unanswered. Could he lead them in the same way? Could he make the decisions that determined life or death in the chaos of battle? Aurelian watched all of this unfold without interruption. He did not challenge publicly. He did not undermine openly. Instead, he allowed the process to reveal itself, to expose its weaknesses naturally. And as it did, the movement toward him began, not as a dramatic shift, but as a series of small, deliberate actions. Officers approached him, not in large groups at first, but individually, then in pairs, then in more organized gatherings. Conversations framed as discussions of strategy, of future campaigns, of the direction the army needed to take. But beneath the surface, the real question was clear. Would he take command? Aurelian did not answer immediately. He asked questions instead, about support, about the mood of the troops, about the positions of different units. He assessed not just willingness, but commitment, because in this environment, partial support was not enough. It had to be decisive, and it became clear that it was. The Danubian legions, hardened by years of warfare, respected strength, competence, and results. Aurelian had demonstrated all three. He was not an unknown. He was not untested. He was one of them, in a way that few others were. The decision, when it came, was not announced with hesitation. At a gathering near Sirmium, where multiple units had assembled, the process followed a pattern that had become familiar during the chaos of the 3rd century. Soldiers raised Aurelian on their shields, a symbolic act that transformed the commander into something more. Voices rose, not in confusion, but in unified declaration. He was proclaimed emperor. It was a moment shaped not by tradition alone, but by necessity. The army had chosen. From that point, events moved quickly. Quintilis, faced with this challenge, had options, but none of them were strong. He could attempt to resist, to gather forces, to confront Aurelian directly. But hesitation had already weakened his position. Support that might have been solid at the beginning now appeared uncertain. Negotiation was considered, perhaps even attempted, but time was not on his side. The balance had shifted. The conflict that followed was brief, almost inevitable in its outcome. Without unified backing, without the confidence of the troops, resistance could not be sustained. Within a matter of days, his position collapsed. His death, whether by his own hand or through the actions of others, marked the end of any serious opposition. Aurelian stood alone. But standing alone did not mean standing secure. He had gained power, but power in this context was not stable. It had to be maintained, reinforced, justified. The empire he now led was not whole. It was divided, strained, facing threats on multiple fronts, internal and external. He understood this. His rise had not been built on illusion. It had been built on the recognition of reality, the same reality that had shaped him from the beginning. Now, that reality demanded more. He was no longer just a commander reacting to events. He was the one who would have to shape them. And almost immediately, the scale of what he faced became clear. Reports began to arrive, not isolated incidents, but coordinated movements. Along the northern frontiers beyond the Alps, something was forming, something larger than a raid, more organized than anything seen in years. Tribes were gathering, forces were assembling, and their target was no longer just the frontier. It was Italy itself, the land that had long been protected by distance, by layers of defense, by the assumption that war would be fought elsewhere, was now exposed. Aurelian had taken the throne at the moment the storm was already moving, and there would be no time to prepare slowly. What came next would test everything he had learned, everything he had built, because the war he had spent his life preparing for was no longer at the edges of the empire. It was coming straight toward its heart. The reports did not arrive all at once. They came in fragments at first, scattered messages from frontier outposts, intercepted communications, hurried accounts from traders and scouts who had seen movement where there should have been none. But as those fragments began to align, a clear and deeply unsettling picture emerged, something far larger than a raid, something that spoke of planning, coordination, and intent. Beyond the Alps, along the fractured edges of the Roman defensive lines, forces were gathering. The Gethungi and the Alemanni, groups that had long been part of the shifting pressure against Rome's northern borders, had done something unusual. They had not acted separately. They had formed a coalition. And not just for a raid. Scouts reported numbers that were difficult to confirm, but impossible to ignore. Tens of thousands of warriors, accompanied not just by fighters, but by entire groups moving with them, families, supplies, herds of animals, carts loaded with tools and equipment. This was not a strike meant to take what could be carried and then withdraw. This was movement with purpose. They intended to stay. For Aurelian, newly raised to imperial power, there was no time to settle into his position, no opportunity to consolidate authority slowly or deal with smaller threats first. This was immediate. This was direct. This was a test not just of his command, but of his right to rule. The passes through the Alps, long considered barriers that limited large-scale invasions, had been studied, probed, and now exploited. The enemy had chosen their routes carefully, moving through terrain that minimized exposure to Roman defenses, avoiding heavily fortified positions, appearing instead where resistance was weakest or slowest to respond. By the time Roman forces fully understood the scale of the invasion, it was already happening. Units that had trained under him, that understood his methods, that could move fast and operate with flexibility, these became the spearhead of his response. Infantry followed where they could, but the initial movements were driven by mounted forces, designed to locate, track, and, when possible, disrupt the invading groups before they could spread further. The challenge was immense. The invading forces did not move as a single, easily targeted army. They spread out, multiple groups advancing along different routes, some focusing on plunder, others on securing positions, others acting as screens or scouts. This fragmentation made it difficult to deliver a decisive blow. Defeat one group and others continued. Aurelian understood that chasing each fragment individually would lead to exhaustion and failure. He needed to identify where the main strength lay, where the movement was concentrated, where a decisive engagement could have the greatest impact. And to do that, he relied on the same principles that had guided him throughout his career: observation, intelligence, and prediction. But even with these advantages, the first major confrontation did not go as planned. Near the city of Placentia, Aurelian's forces encountered a significant enemy group. The terrain was difficult, broken, offering concealment, limiting visibility. The enemy, familiar with ambush tactics, used this to their advantage. The engagement that followed was sharp, chaotic, and costly. Roman forces, moving to engage, found themselves struck from unexpected directions. The cohesion that Aurelian valued was tested under conditions that disrupted communication and coordination. Units became separated, the flow of battle shifting rapidly, moments of confusion emerging where clarity was needed most. It was not a total defeat, but it was a setback. Losses were taken. Momentum was disrupted. More importantly, it revealed something critical. The enemy was not only numerous, but capable. They were not simply overwhelming through numbers. They were thinking, adapting, using the terrain effectively. For Aurelian, this moment could not be ignored. He withdrew, not in panic, but in calculation, pulling his forces back to regroup, to reassess. This was not the time for pride. It was the time for adjustment. He analyzed what had happened. The fragmentation of the enemy, the terrain, the speed of movement, the need for tighter coordination between units, all of it pointed to one conclusion. He needed to impose order on a situation that naturally resisted it. And he began to do exactly that. Instead of reacting to each movement, he began shaping the battlefield more deliberately. He positioned forces to control key routes, limiting where the enemy could move without confrontation. He used his cavalry not just to engage, but to observe continuously, maintaining awareness of enemy positions and movements at all times. He forced the invaders to respond to him. As Roman forces restructured, the next engagements began to shift. Near Fano, Aurelian's army confronted one of the main invading groups under conditions far more favorable. The terrain was more open, allowing for better coordination, clearer lines of sight, and more effective use of cavalry. This time, the engagement unfolded differently. Roman units held formation. Cavalry struck with precision, not charging blindly, but targeting specific points, disrupting cohesion, isolating segments of the enemy force. Infantry advanced steadily, maintaining pressure, preventing regrouping. The invaders, still dangerous, still aggressive, found themselves unable to replicate the advantages they had exploited earlier. The result was decisive. The Roman army held the field. The enemy suffered significant losses. More importantly, their momentum was broken. What had begun as a confident advance into Italy now faced resistance that was organized, adaptive, and increasingly effective. But Aurelian did not stop there. He pursued, not recklessly, but persistently, applying pressure, forcing the remaining groups to retreat, denying them the opportunity to regroup or reestablish their advance. Engagements continued, smaller clashes, pursuits, moments where the enemy attempted to break away and was intercepted. At Pavia, another confrontation further weakened the invading forces, pushing them back toward the routes they had used to enter. The campaign, which had begun with fear and uncertainty, was turning. And as it turned, something else changed as well. The perception of Aurelian. At the beginning, he had been a new emperor, untested in his role, facing immediate crisis. Doubts had existed quietly beneath the surface. Could he lead not just as a general, but as the one responsible for the entire empire? Now, those doubts were fading. He had faced invasion at the heart of Rome's territory and responded not with hesitation, but with action. He had taken a setback and turned it into adjustment. He had regained control of a situation that could have spiraled into disaster. The soldiers saw this. They had followed him through uncertainty, through initial difficulty, and now through success. Their confidence grew, not because of proclamations or titles, but because of results. Italy, though shaken, was not lost. The invaders, though still dangerous, were no longer unstoppable. And Aurelian, standing at the center of it, had passed his first true test as emperor. But he knew, even as the immediate threat began to recede, that this was only the beginning. Because beyond this invasion, beyond the frontiers, beyond even the territories still under Roman control, the empire remained divided. In the west, a separate empire still stood. In the east, a powerful queen ruled lands that once answered to Rome. And the task before him was not just to defend what remained. It was to take it all back. And that would require far more than victory in a single campaign. The victories in northern Italy did not bring celebration in the way earlier Roman triumphs once had. There were no immediate grand processions, no illusion that the danger had fully passed, because Aurelian understood something very clearly. What had just happened was not an isolated crisis. It was a warning, and if the empire continued as it had, reacting instead of preparing, that warning would become something far worse. The land itself showed the cost. Fields burned or abandoned, roads littered with the remnants of movement and conflict, towns that had survived now carrying the memory of how close they had come to destruction. Italy, for generations shielded from sustained invasion, had felt the reality of war again, and that reality could not be ignored. Aurelian did not treat the victory as an endpoint. He treated it as a beginning. One of his first realizations was that the old assumptions about security no longer held. The idea that the capital itself, the symbolic and administrative heart of the empire, could rely on distance and layered defenses had been proven false. If large forces could reach northern Italy, then under the right conditions, they could push even further. Rome itself was exposed. For centuries, the city had not needed massive defensive walls. Its power had been projected outward, its security ensured by the strength of its armies far from its center. But that world no longer existed. Aurelian made a decision that would redefine the physical shape of the capital. He ordered the construction of a new defensive system, massive walls that would encircle the city, not as a temporary measure, but as a permanent recognition of the changed reality. These would become known as the Aurelian Walls, and their scale reflected both urgency and intent. Work began quickly. Laborers, soldiers, engineers, all were mobilized. Existing structures were incorporated where possible, but much had to be built from the ground up. The walls stretched for miles, enclosing not just the ancient core, but expanded areas, ensuring that Rome could sustain itself if threatened, that it could withstand siege, that it would no longer rely solely on distant defenses. This was not just construction. It was a statement. Aurelian was acknowledging openly what many had already felt, that the empire was no longer untouchable, that adaptation was necessary, that survival depended on accepting reality rather than clinging to past assumptions. At the same time, he began addressing another problem, one less visible but equally dangerous: the state of the army itself. Years of crisis had strained the military system. Units were under strength, supply chains inconsistent, discipline uneven in places where leadership had faltered. Loyalty, while strong in some regions, was fragmented in others, tied more to individual commanders than to central authority. Aurelian moved carefully. He did not attempt immediate, sweeping reforms that might disrupt what stability remained. Instead, he reinforced what worked. He ensured that soldiers were paid as reliably as circumstances allowed. He maintained the flow of supplies, prioritizing the needs of active forces. He rewarded units that had performed well, reinforcing the idea that effectiveness would be recognized. At the same time, he strengthened his own position within the army. His command style remained consistent, direct, practical, focused on results. He was not distant. He was present, visible to his troops, involved in decisions, aware of conditions on the ground. This mattered in an army that valued leadership proven through action rather than authority granted by title. The effect was gradual but clear. Confidence grew, not just in individual units, but in the idea that the empire, under this leadership, could respond effectively to threats. This was critical because what lay ahead would require not just strength, but unity. And unity was something the empire did not yet have. To the west, beyond Italy, a separate power had established itself, the Gallic Empire, controlling large portions of what had once been Roman territory, including regions that were economically and strategically vital. It operated with its own administration, its own military, its own leadership, functioning not as a temporary rebellion, but as an alternative center of power. To the east, an even more formidable presence had emerged. Centered in the city of Palmyra, a kingdom had risen under the leadership of Zenobia, extending control over vast territories including Syria, Egypt, and parts of Anatolia. This was not a simple revolt. It was a structured, capable state with resources, organization, and ambition. The empire was divided. 3 centers of power, each functioning independently, each capable of sustaining itself, each presenting a challenge that could not be ignored indefinitely. Aurelian understood the scale of this. Reuniting the empire would not be a single campaign. It would require time, planning, and the careful sequencing of actions. Facing all enemies at once would be impossible. He would have to choose, prioritize, and strike where success was most achievable. But before he could move outward, he had to ensure stability within. The Senate, though diminished in direct power, still represented an important element of legitimacy. Aurelian maintained formal relations, presenting his actions within the framework of continuity, not revolution. He did not position himself as a destroyer of tradition, but as its defender under extraordinary circumstances. This balance was important. Too much reliance on military authority alone could alienate civilian structures. Too much deference to tradition could limit necessary action. Aurelian navigated between these, maintaining support where it mattered while retaining the freedom to act decisively. Economic conditions also demanded attention. Years of instability had weakened currency, disrupted trade, and strained local economies. While large-scale reform would come later, immediate measures focused on stabilization, ensuring that basic functions continued, that resources could be directed where needed, particularly toward the military efforts that would soon expand. Every decision, every action pointed toward a larger objective: preparation. Aurelian was not simply reacting anymore. He was building toward something, creating the conditions necessary for a series of campaigns that would aim not just to defend, but to reclaim. His focus began to turn east. The territories under Zenobia represented both a threat and an opportunity. They were wealthy, strategically critical, and currently outside imperial control. But they were also distant from the core of his immediate power base, requiring careful planning to approach effectively. Before moving, he ensured that the northern frontiers were stable enough, that Italy was secure, that the army was prepared for extended operations beyond familiar regions. This was not a rush. It was deliberate, because Aurelian understood something that had been reinforced throughout his life, from the fields of Pannonia Inferior to the chaos of Edessa, that success did not come from acting quickly alone, but from acting at the right moment, under the right conditions, with the right preparation. And that moment was approaching. The empire, fractured and strained, stood at a turning point. Its future would not be decided by defense alone. It would be decided by whether it could be made whole again. And Aurelian, who had risen from the harshest edges of that empire, was now preparing to attempt something few before him had faced, not just victory in battle, but the restoration of Rome itself. The next step would take him far from Italy, into lands where his authority was not recognized, where his enemies were organized, confident, and ready to defend what they had built. And the outcome of that confrontation would determine whether the empire remained divided or began, finally, to come back together. The decision to move east was not made lightly, and it was not made quickly, because Aurelian understood that every mile away from Italy was a mile where uncertainty grew, where messages took longer, where control became harder to maintain. But at the same time, the situation demanded action, because the eastern provinces were no longer simply drifting away from Rome. They had become something else entirely. They had become a rival power. At the center of it stood Zenobia, ruling from the city of Palmyra, a city that had once been a trade hub, a bridge between empires, but had now transformed into the capital of a kingdom that controlled Syria, Egypt, and large parts of Anatolia. What made this situation so dangerous was not just territorial loss, but the fact that this was not a collapsing region. It was a functioning state. Zenobia's administration was structured, her armies disciplined, her court aware of Roman politics and military weaknesses. She was not a rebel in the chaotic sense Rome had dealt with before. She was a ruler, and she had built something that could not be ignored. For Aurelian, this meant the next campaign would not resemble the frontier wars of his earlier life, nor even the invasion of Italy. This was a confrontation between organized systems, between two centers of authority claiming legitimacy over the same world. He began his preparations carefully. Supply lines were established in advance, routes secured through friendly or neutral territories, forward positions strengthened to prevent overextension. Unlike earlier campaigns where speed sometimes compensated for limited planning, this time the scale demanded precision. The eastern provinces were distant, vast, and politically complex. But Aurelian also knew something important. Zenobia's strength was real, but it was also concentrated. Her power depended on control of key cities, key trade routes, and the loyalty of local elites who had benefited from her rule. This was different from the scattered tribal forces of the north. It was centralized, which meant it could be broken if struck correctly. The first movements of the campaign were deliberate. Roman forces advanced through Anatolia, securing cities that had previously aligned with Palmyra. In many cases, resistance was minimal. Some regions had supported Zenobia out of necessity rather than loyalty, and when confronted with a strong Roman response, they shifted back quickly, recognizing where long-term survival likely lay. Aurelian did not waste time punishing hesitation. He needed momentum. As his army moved deeper into the east, the scale of the conflict became clearer. Palmyrene forces were not disorganized. They were prepared. Cavalry units, archers, and disciplined infantry formations met Roman advances in structured engagements rather than scattered resistance. But Aurelian had learned something over years of warfare that few commanders truly internalized. No system is invulnerable everywhere. The key was identifying where pressure would break it fastest. He focused on communication routes, on isolating key cities, on forcing decisions rather than allowing the enemy to maintain flexibility. Bit by bit, the structure of Zenobia's control began to strain. Then came the confrontation near the region of Emesa. This was not a small engagement. It was one of the defining moments of the campaign. Zenobia's forces, led by experienced commanders, met the Roman army in a battle that would determine whether the Eastern Rebellion could hold its ground or begin to collapse. The battlefield was complex, open terrain mixed with urban proximity, allowing for both cavalry maneuvers and infantry engagements. Zenobia's army used its strengths well, particularly its cavalry, which attempted to replicate the mobility-based tactics that had served them across the region. But Aurelian had anticipated this. He positioned his forces not to simply meet the charge, but to absorb and redirect it. Roman infantry held firm under pressure, maintaining formation, while cavalry units struck at the flanks, disrupting coordination and preventing the enemy from fully exploiting their mobility. The battle was not quick. It unfolded in phases, shifts of momentum, moments where one side appeared to gain advantage before being forced back into balance. But gradually, Roman discipline began to impose structure on the chaos. The turning point came when Zenobia's cavalry, attempting a concentrated strike, was drawn into a controlled engagement where Roman reserves were waiting. What had been intended as a decisive blow instead became a contained failure. From that moment, the battle shifted decisively. Palmyrene forces began to withdraw, not in total collapse, but in retreat that signaled recognition that the field could not be held. Aurelian did not allow them to regroup easily. He pressed forward, maintaining pressure, preventing reorganization. Emesa marked the beginning of the end of open resistance. Zenobia herself withdrew toward Palmyra, and Aurelian followed. The march to Palmyra was not just military movement, it was psychological pressure. Cities along the route, seeing the outcome at Emesa, increasingly reconsidered their position. Some opened their gates. Others prepared defenses, but hesitated to commit fully. The sense of inevitability began to spread. Palmyra itself was impressive, both in wealth and in fortification. Its walls, strengthened during Zenobia's rule, reflected both pride and preparation. This was not a city expecting to fall easily, but Aurelian did not rush. He understood sieges were not just about force, but about endurance and psychology. Cutting supply routes, controlling surrounding territory, preventing escape or reinforcement, these were as important as direct assault. The city was gradually isolated. Inside, conditions began to shift. Food supplies became strained. Morale, once supported by confidence in Zenobia's leadership, began to face pressure from the reality of prolonged siege. Outside, Roman forces maintained steady control, building siege works, monitoring movements, tightening the noose. Zenobia attempted to negotiate. She sought terms that would preserve her position or at least ensure survival under Roman authority. But Aurelian, recognizing the broader implications of the conflict, did not offer compromise on terms that would leave a rival power intact. The message was clear: reintegration, not division. When Zenobia attempted to escape the city, hoping perhaps to reach allies further east, she was intercepted. The details of her capture vary in accounts, but the outcome was consistent. She was taken into Roman custody, ending her role as an independent ruler. With her removal, Palmyra's resistance collapsed. The city, once a symbol of Eastern independence, was brought back under Roman control. Some resistance continued briefly, including a later uprising, but it was quickly suppressed. Aurelian's response was decisive, leaving no room for the re-establishment of separate authority. The Eastern campaign had succeeded. In a relatively short span of time, one of the empire's most significant breakaway regions had been reintegrated. Trade routes reopened under Roman control. Administrative structures were restored or replaced. The political message was unmistakable. Rome was no longer retreating. But Aurelian did not linger in the east to celebrate. Because while one half of the empire had been brought back under control, another still remained outside it. To the west, the Gallic Empire still stood, controlling vast territories that included Gaul, parts of Germania, and Hispania. It had its own emperor, its own administration, its own military structure. And unlike the East, it had not yet been directly confronted. Aurelian now turned his attention in that direction, because reunification was not complete, and the hardest part of his campaign was still ahead. The return from the East was not a return to peace. It was a transition into the next crisis, because even as messengers carried news of Palmyra's fall back across the empire, Aurelian was already turning his attention toward the western territories that had long since ceased to behave like provinces and instead functioned as an independent state. The so-called Gallic realm, the Gallic Empire, had existed long enough to establish its own legitimacy in the eyes of many of its inhabitants. It had its own emperors, its own administrative systems, its own military hierarchy. For many living within its borders, Rome was no longer a central authority. It was a distant memory. But Aurelian saw it differently. To him, it was not a separate civilization. It was a fracture that had to be repaired. The Western campaign began with something deceptively simple: movement. Roman forces advanced into northern Italy again, but this time there was no invading barbarian coalition, no sudden emergency. Instead, there was controlled pressure, deliberate and structured. Aurelian was not rushing into chaos. He was reasserting authority step by step. The Gallic Empire, by this stage, was already under internal strain. Its economy depended heavily on regional stability. Its legitimacy rested on military success, and its leadership had to constantly balance local demands with frontier defense. Over time, this created tension between central authority and regional commanders, between ambition and necessity. Aurelian exploited that tension. He did not begin by attacking the heart of the Western regime. Instead, he targeted its periphery, cities and provinces that had once been Roman, that still remembered imperial administration, that still measured legitimacy against Rome rather than against the breakaway state that currently governed them. As Roman forces approached, something important began to happen. Resistance was not uniform. Some cities prepared defenses, loyal to the Gallic administration. Others hesitated, and many, when faced with the return of a strong central Roman army, chose to submit without battle. This was not just military movement, it was psychological reversal. The idea of separation that had hardened over years began to soften under pressure. The question was no longer which empire do we belong to, but which empire will survive this moment. And increasingly, the answer was shifting. At the center of the Gallic realm stood its final major ruler, Tetricus I. Unlike Zenobia, who had actively built a rival state through expansion and conquest, Tetricus inherited a system already under strain. His authority was real, but fragile, dependent on military loyalty and political compromise. As Aurelian advanced, he understood something critical. This would not be another prolonged siege campaign like Palmyra. The West would break differently. The decisive moment came as Roman and Gallic forces moved toward confrontation in the region of Chalons. This was not just a battlefield, it was symbolic terrain. The plains of Gaul had long been the stage for decisive clashes, where control of movement and logistics mattered as much as raw strength. Both sides prepared for engagement, but what unfolded did not become a prolonged, evenly matched war. Instead, something far more politically complex began to happen beneath the surface. As the Roman army approached, communication channels between Gallic commanders and their emperor became strained. Some officers, especially those with prior service in the broader Roman system, began to reconsider their position. They were not fighting a foreign enemy. They were facing the central empire returning under a new and highly effective leadership. Aurelian understood this better than most. He did not seek to destroy the Gallic army outright if he could avoid it. He sought to fracture its unity. Pressure was applied in layers. Military presence in key regions. Negotiations with local commanders. Offers of clemency for those who submitted early. The message was consistent. Reintegration was possible. Resistance was optional, but continued separation would be punished. The effect was gradual but unmistakable. By the time full engagement became inevitable, the Gallic Empire was no longer fully unified in purpose. Then came the final breakdown. rather than a single catastrophic battle that ended the conflict in one moment. What occurred was a collapse of cohesion. Units began to defect or stand down. Commanders hesitated. Orders were delayed or ignored. The chain of authority weakened under the pressure of uncertainty. Tetricus, facing the reality that his position could not be sustained indefinitely against Aurelian's consolidated forces and the shifting loyalty of his own military structure, made a decision that would define the end of the Western breakaway state. In a dramatic and highly symbolic turn, he surrendered. The meeting between Aurelian and Tetricus is often described in later accounts as one of contrasts. The victorious emperor representing a reunited military power, the defeated ruler representing a system that had existed out of necessity but could no longer survive against renewed central authority. Tetricus was not destroyed in the way enemies of Rome sometimes were. Instead, he was incorporated back into the imperial structure, his surrender serving as both an end and a demonstration. The Gallic Empire, as a separate entity, ceased to exist. Its territories were reintegrated into Roman control. Its administrative systems were absorbed or dismantled. Its military forces were redistributed under imperial command. And just like that, the Western fracture that had persisted for years was closed. But Aurelian did not treat this as a moment for celebration, because reunification, though symbolically achieved, still required consolidation. He had now accomplished something extraordinary. The East had been brought back under control. The West had been restored. The empire, which had seemed permanently divided, was once again under a single authority. Yet he understood something very clearly. Empires do not survive reunification by symbolism alone. They survive through enforcement, stability, and continuous presence of power. And there were still problems waiting beneath the surface. Frontiers still under pressure. Economies still destabilized. Administrative systems still weakened by years of fragmentation. So instead of returning to Rome in triumph and stepping back, Aurelian continued working. He reorganized provinces, reassigned military commands, and strengthened frontier defenses. He moved quickly because he understood that hesitation could allow old fractures to reopen. His reputation now carried a different weight. He was no longer just a military commander who had become emperor. He was the man who had taken a broken empire and forced it back into unity. But that unity was still new, still fragile. And history had already shown, many times before, that what is restored through strength must be constantly maintained through strength. And so even as Rome appeared whole again on maps and in proclamations, Aurelian knew the truth beneath it. The real challenge was not reunification. It was keeping it together. After the victories in the West, the empire finally looked whole again on paper, but Aurelian knew better than most that maps do not hold empires together. People do, armies do, trust does, and all three of those things have been damaged over years of crisis in ways that no single campaign could fully repair. So instead of resting on the idea of reunification, he immediately turned towards something far more difficult, rebuilding what had been broken from the inside. One of the first problems he confronted was economic instability. Years of civil war, barbarian incursions, and breakaway states had shattered the normal flow of taxation and trade. Provinces had been forced to survive independently for long periods. Local commanders had issued their own currency or relied on debased coinage. Markets had become unpredictable, and trust in imperial money had weakened significantly. The result was not just inflation, but confusion. People no longer knew what Roman currency represented in practical terms. Prices varied wildly between regions. Soldiers, who depended on stable pay, often found their wages losing value before they even reached them. Aurelian responded with direct intervention. He reformed the coinage system, attempting to restore confidence by standardizing and reinforcing imperial currency. This was not just an economic measure. It was a political one. Money was one of the clearest symbols of authority, and controlling it meant controlling how the empire defined value itself. At the same time, he worked to ensure that military pay was more consistent. Because the army was not just one institution among many, it was the foundation of imperial stability. If soldiers lost confidence in the system itself would collapse again. But reforming currency and stabilizing payments was only part of the challenge. There was also the issue of legitimacy. For years, different regions had grown used to different rulers, different administrations, different expectations. Even though the empire was now officially reunited, loyalty was not automatically restored everywhere. In some areas, imperial authority still felt distant or theoretical. Aurelian understood that fear alone was not enough to maintain unity. There needed to be structure. He began reinforcing administrative control across provinces, replacing unreliable governors, consolidating authority where fragmentation had occurred, and ensuring that imperial directives actually reached and were enforced at local levels. This required constant movement. Aurelian was rarely still. He traveled, inspected, corrected, adjusted. His presence itself became a tool of governance, because in an empire that had recently been divided, seeing the emperor in person carried weight that written orders could not match. But with every reform, pressure increased. Not everyone benefited equally from the changes. Local elites who had grown used to autonomy during the crisis now found themselves under tighter imperial oversight. Officials who had gained influence in the absence of strong central control now faced replacement or reduction in authority. And within Rome itself, there were tensions as well. The Senate, while no longer the primary power center, still represented tradition, prestige, and a certain vision of how the empire should function. Aurelian, shaped by military reality rather than aristocratic tradition, often moved faster than senatorial expectations could comfortably accept. He did not openly reject them, but he did not always defer to them either. This balance created quiet friction. Meanwhile, in the military, expectations were also shifting. Soldiers who had followed Aurelian through campaigns in the East and West expected rewards, land, recognition, and stability. Some received it, but the empire's limited resources meant not everyone could be satisfied. That gap between expectation and reality always carries risk. Still, for a time, his authority remained strong. He had proven himself repeatedly in war. He had reunited the empire. He had restored order where chaos had dominated. Few questioned his capability. But capability and acceptance are not the same thing as comfort. And as months passed, a different kind of atmosphere began to form. Less open crisis, more quiet tension. Less collapse, more unease. The most dangerous part of Aurelian's reign was not when the empire was breaking apart, but when it had just been put back together. Because that is when every unresolved grievance, every displaced ambition, and every unsettled expectation exists at the same time under a single authority. And Aurelian, despite his skill, could not remove all of them at once. At some point during his movements through Thrace and the Eastern Balkans, a situation developed involving members of his own administrative circle. Details vary in surviving accounts, but the core element is consistent. There was fear among certain officials that they might fall out of favor or be punished for past actions or perceived disloyalties. In an empire recently stabilized through force, fear spreads quickly through the system. Some individuals acted preemptively. What followed was not a battlefield confrontation, not a foreign invasion, but something far more internal and far more final. Aurelian was assassinated by members of his own staff, officers who believed, correctly or incorrectly, that they were at risk of being removed or punished. The emperor who had restored unity to Rome was gone, suddenly, without warning, and the reaction across the empire was immediate and uncertain. Because unlike previous transitions, there was no clear external enemy to rally against. There was no invading army at the gates. There was only the question of what comes next. The empire he had rebuilt did not immediately fall apart. That itself was his legacy, but it also did not immediately stabilize under a single unquestioned successor. Instead, it entered another period of uncertainty, where the structures he had strengthened were tested without his direct control. And the lesson that remained was not simple. Aurelian had shown that even a shattered empire could be restored through force, discipline, and relentless action. But his death showed something just as important. That restoring an empire is not the same as making it safe. And that even the strongest system still depends, in the end, on the fragile balance between authority, loyalty, and fear. And once that balance breaks, even slightly, history can change direction again. The moment news of Aurelian's death began spread, it did not immediately trigger the collapse many might have expected from an empire that had so recently been fractured and rebuilt. Instead, there was something more complicated, a pause, a hesitation, as if the entire political and military system was trying to understand what had just happened before deciding how to respond. For a brief time, the empire existed in a state of uncertainty. Soldiers in the field waited for confirmation of orders. Governors in provinces assessed whether directives would continue to be enforced. Cities watched carefully for signs of instability or competing claims to authority. But unlike the earlier years of crisis, there was no immediate rush of breakaway movements, no rapid declaration of rival emperors in distant regions. That alone showed how much Aurelian had changed the structure of power. Even in death, his system held. The military remained the backbone of imperial authority, but it now operated within a more centralized framework than it had during the worst years of fragmentation. Command structures he had reinforced were still functioning. Supply lines he had stabilized still operated. The idea of a unified empire, recently restored through force and discipline, had not yet been discarded. But the question of succession still had to be answered. And that question immediately revealed how fragile stability still was. Different factions within the army, the administration, and even the Senate began to position themselves around potential candidates. Some favored continuity through military leadership. Others leaned toward figures who might ease tensions between civilian elites and the armed forces. Unlike earlier imperial transitions during the crisis of the 3rd century, there was no single dominant figure with Aurelian's combination of battlefield authority and widespread loyalty across multiple regions. That absence created space for negotiation, but also for conflict. However, something important had changed since the years before Aurelian's reign. The empire was no longer in a condition where multiple breakaway states could easily form and survive indefinitely. The reunification campaigns against the Gallic Empire and the eastern realm of Zenobia had demonstrated that fragmentation could be reversed and that regional powers, no matter how established, could be reintegrated under decisive central leadership. That realization had altered the political imagination of the empire itself. Even ambitious leaders now had to consider not just whether they could seize power, but whether they could hold it against a system that had recently proven capable of reasserting unity. Eventually, the army itself intervened in the succession process. Rather than allowing prolonged instability, senior military leaders moved to ensure a controlled transition. Their priority was not ideological purity or dynastic legitimacy, but continuity. The system that Aurelian had restored was too recently rebuilt to risk another collapse. So a compromise was reached. A new emperor was chosen, one who could be accepted by the military and tolerated by the political establishment, even if he did not possess Aurelian's extraordinary combination of authority and battlefield reputation. It was not a perfect solution, but it prevented immediate fragmentation, and that, in the context of the time, was success. As the empire stabilized again, Aurelian's legacy began to take shape in a more permanent way. His walls at Rome remained, not just as defensive structures, but as symbols of a changed reality, a recognition that even the capital of the ancient world now required protection. His military reforms influenced how future emperors understood frontier defense, emphasizing mobility, flexibility, and rapid response over static assumptions of security. His campaigns against the East and West became reference points for what imperial power could still achieve when fully mobilized. And perhaps most importantly, he left behind a psychological shift. Before Aurelian, The idea that the empire might permanently fracture had begun to feel increasingly real. After him, even in moments of weakness, the idea of reunification remained part of political thinking. The empire could be divided, but it could also be brought back together. That distinction mattered, because it changed what leaders believed was possible. In the long arc of Roman history, Aurelian's reign became a turning point between fragmentation and restoration, between an empire that was losing its coherence and one that, at least for a time, learned how to reassert it. He did not solve every problem. He did not end every crisis. But he proved something essential, that even in one of the darkest periods of imperial history, Rome was still capable of being rebuilt. And that idea, once demonstrated, could not be fully erased. It would echo through the centuries that followed, shaping how later emperors understood power, survival, and the constant struggle to hold an empire together against forces both outside its borders and within its own structure. And in that sense, even after his death, Aurelian remained present in the empire he had restored, not as a ruler, but as a standard of what had once been achieved and what might, under the right circumstances, be achieved again. After the immediate shock of Aurelian's assassination faded, what remained was not collapse, but something more subtle and more important: adaptation. The empire had lost a ruler who had been unusually direct, unusually forceful, and unusually effective at holding its fractured pieces together. But it did not return to the same condition it had been in before his reign. Something had changed at a structural level, something that could not simply be undone by his death. The most visible change was psychological. Across provinces, armies, and administrative centers, there was now a shared memory of what had happened under Aurelian. An empire that had been split into competing states, then forced back into unity through decisive military action. That memory mattered because it set a new expectation, even when authority weakened, even when internal politics became unstable. The idea that unity could be restored remained firmly embedded in how Roman leaders thought about power. The provinces that had once formed the Gallic Empire were no longer viewed as permanently lost. The eastern territories once ruled by Zenobia were no longer seen as unreachable. They were seen as recoverable, if ever required again. That shift alone altered the future trajectory of imperial policy. Aurelian's reforms also outlived him in more practical ways. The fortified system he had ordered around Rome, the Aurelian walls, remained in place and continued to define the defensive mindset of the capital. Rome was no longer an unguarded symbol of imperial confidence. It had become a fortified administrative center, reflecting a new reality where even the heart of the empire had to be protected. Military organization, too, carried forward his influence. Future emperors inherited an army that had been reorganized under the pressures of constant frontier warfare, shaped into a more mobile, responsive force. The lessons learned from fighting both barbarian coalitions in the north and structured eastern armies had permanently altered Roman tactical thinking. The empire would never again rely solely on the older assumption that static legions alone could secure vast borders without flexible support. Economically, the system remained fragile, but Aurelian's efforts to stabilize currency and centralize control created a temporary foundation that later administrations could build upon. Even when reforms faltered, the concept that imperial authority extended into monetary stability had been firmly reasserted. But perhaps the most lasting legacy was not a structure, but an idea. Before Aurelian, the Roman Empire of the 3rd century had begun to drift toward fragmentation, as if it were an inevitable outcome of scale, pressure, and internal strain. Multiple emperors, regional breakaways, and constant invasions had made unity seem like something temporary, something that could exist only briefly before breaking apart again. Aurelian interrupted that assumption. He demonstrated that fragmentation was not permanent, that even after division, collapse, and competing regimes, a single authority could reassert control across the entire system, if it was willing to act decisively and continuously. This did not make the empire stable in a modern sense. It did not eliminate future crises. It did not prevent later divisions or struggles for power. But it changed the mindset of survival. Rome was no longer just an empire that endured pressure. It was an empire that could be rebuilt, and that distinction shaped everything that followed. In the decades after his death, emperors who faced similar crises would measure themselves, consciously or unconsciously, against what Aurelian had achieved. Some would attempt to replicate his speed, others his ruthlessness, others his administrative consolidation. Few would match his combination of all three, but none could ignore it, because after Aurelian, the question was no longer whether the Roman Empire could fracture. It was whether anyone capable enough would rise to restore it again. And that idea became part of Rome's political DNA for centuries to come. The empire would continue to face invasions, internal conflict, economic pressure, and political instability. It would transform, split, and reform in different ways across its long history. But the precedent set during Aurelian's reign remained fixed at its core. Even when broken, it could be brought back together. And that belief, more than any single battle or reform, is what defined his legacy. Not just a restorer of Rome in his own time, but a proof that restoration itself was possible. And in the long story of the Roman world, that proof was one of the most important victories of all.